Consider these expressions: the lady drinking a martini, the thief, the horse that escaped, the broken window. These are examples of what are often called definite descriptions. And we use expressions like these to draw attention to a specific person or thing that we want to say something about. So I might say, the lady drinking a martini is a famous writer, or the thief wears size 10 shoes. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell, writing in the early 1900s, put forward a view about what we're saying when we utter a sentence like, the lady drinking a martini is a famous writer. Speaking of the lady drinking a martini, or the thief, or the horse that escaped, implies a uniqueness. It implies that there's just one. So according to Russell, when you say, the lady drinking a martini is a famous writer, you're committing yourself to the view not just that there is a lady drinking a martini, but that there is exactly one lady drinking a martini, and you're saying that she is a famous writer. Now, Russell's view about what we're saying when we say the lady drinking a martini is a famous writer is actually controversial, but it's our best option for translating those types of statements into the formal languages that we're working with. So for our purposes going forward, we're going to assume that Russell's theory of descriptions is correct. We're going to assume that he's right about what we're saying when we say the lady drinking a martini is a famous writer. And we'll just work on translating those types of statements under that assumption, under the assumption that Russell's theory of descriptions is correct. So let's suppose that we have a QL identity language with the proper name O, a one-place predicate P, a one-place predicate T, a two-place predicate F, and a two-place predicate N, where we imagine that the domain of quantification is all people. O refers to Oscar, P expresses the property of liking pizza, T, the property of being a toddler, F, the friends with relation, and N expresses the neighbors with relation. And now, working with that QL identity language, let's translate these three statements: the toddler likes pizza, the person who is friends with Oscar is not a toddler, and the person who is friends with everyone is friends with no one. And I put a little asterisk on this last one for reasons that I'll get into when we get to that one. So starting with the statement, the toddler likes pizza. So we're going to assume that Russell's analysis of what this statement is saying is correct and translate it on that basis. So according to Russell's theory of descriptions, the claim the toddler likes pizza is saying there is exactly one individual that is a toddler and they like pizza. Okay, now let's deal with there is exactly one individual that is a toddler first. There is exactly one individual that is a toddler. That's to say there is an X such that X is a toddler. And for any individual Y, if Y is a toddler, then Y must be identical to X because we want to say there's exactly one such person. So we add for all Y. If Y is a toddler, then Y has to be identical to X. So far, we've captured this first part of the statement that there's exactly one individual that's a toddler. And now we have to add that they like pizza. That individual who is the only one that is a toddler, we have to say they like pizza. So we have, there is an X. So we're saying X is a toddler. Anyone who's a toddler has to be identical to X. So this X is the only toddler that exists. And we want to say, and they like pizza. So, and PX. And that captures the statement that the toddler likes pizza, at least assuming Russell's analysis of what that statement is saying. Okay, moving on now to this second example. The person who is friends with Oscar is not a toddler. So again, using Russell's analysis of what this is saying, we would see this as saying that there is an individual who is friends with Oscar. So there is an X such that FXO, there is someone that's friends with Oscar, and they're the only individual that's friends with Oscar. There's exactly one individual who's friends with Oscar. So X is friends with Oscar, and for all Y, if Y is friends with Oscar, then Y must just be X because there's no one else who's friends with Oscar. So again, so far we've captured this idea that there's exactly one person who's friends with Oscar, and we want to say they are not a toddler. So we would add as a last conjunct, it's not the case that TX. And that, again, assuming Russell's analysis of these types of statements is correct, this would give us our translation of the person who is friends with Oscar is not a toddler. Now, one last comment to make about statement 2 here. Some people would argue that it's ambiguous. We have this first reading here where the person who's making this statement is saying there is exactly one individual that's friends with Oscar. They agree with that. They're just denying that that person is a toddler. But we could also imagine someone who disagrees in the first place with the claim that there's exactly one individual that's friends with Oscar. Maybe this person thinks that Oscar has 5 friends, say. That person would disagree with any statement that started the person who is friends with Oscar, because they don't think there is such a person. They think it's a mistake to talk about such an individual in the first place. So in particular, that person, the person who thinks maybe Oscar has 5 friends or 10 friends, they would disagree with the claim the person who is friends with Oscar is a toddler. Again, because I think it's a mistake to talk about the person who is friends with Oscar. And perhaps such an individual could express their disagreement with the claim the person who is friends with Oscar is a toddler by uttering this sentence. By saying the person who is friends with Oscar is not a toddler, perhaps that could be used to express the denial of the claim that the person who is friends with Oscar is a toddler. That is, perhaps it could be used to express it's not the case that there exists an X such that X is friends with Oscar and is the only individual that's friends with Oscar and is a toddler. Perhaps this English statement could also be used to express this idea, which again, someone might take issue with this statement simply because they think there is no unique individual who is friends with Oscar. Oscar has 5 friends or 10 friends. So while this is, I think, the most natural interpretation of statement 2 here, perhaps this interpretation is also possible. Someone who just thinks there is no unique individual who is friends with Oscar and so would deny any statement that begins the person who is friends with Oscar, blah, blah, blah. Perhaps they could express themselves in this way. No, it's not true that the person who is friends with Oscar is a toddler, because there is no such unique individual. Maybe they could express themselves in this way, and what they're trying to say is really this, which is different from this. So both translations, I think, are potentially correct, whereas this is maybe the most natural one on a problem set. I would accept either answer. Okay, now let's move on to this last problem. The person who is friends with everyone is friends with no one. Now, I could look at this statement and see the phrase, the person who is friends with everyone, and see this as a statement of the form VF is G. This is just like the other examples that we've looked at. I could say to myself, and so I'm going to approach it in the same way. So I've got to say, okay, this is saying the person who is friends with everyone. So I've got to say there is an X such that X is friends with everyone, such that for all Y, X is friends with Y. And this individual who's friends with everyone, they're the only individual who's friends with everyone. They're the person who's friends with everyone. So there is an X such that X is friends with everyone. And for all Y, if Y is friends with everyone, if for all Z, FYZ, then Y has to be identical to X. So now I've got, there is exactly one individual that is friends with everyone. And if I'm treating this statement as just like the others that we looked at, I would continue this translation by saying, and they are friends with no one. That is, it's not the case that there is a Y such that X is friends with Y. Okay, so if I treat this sentence just like I treated the previous two, where I see it as a statement of the form VF is G, then I would end up with this translation. And perhaps, that is one legitimate reading of this English sentence. This English sentence could be used to assert this. But note that when we interpret this English statement this way, what is being said really makes no sense. It's a contradiction. We have there is an X such that X is friends with everyone, and there is no one that X is friends with. So this statement contradicts itself, and that should lead us to go back to this statement and maybe find a different interpretation, because the English statement, the person who is friends with everyone is friends with no one, is that a contradiction? Does that sound like an absurdity? Maybe I don't agree with this statement, but I could maybe see some truth in it or see what someone's trying to get at. It doesn't just sound like an incoherent contradiction. So to really capture what this statement is saying, maybe I should read it a little differently. It seems like maybe what this person is really trying to say is take any individual. If they were to be friends with everyone, then they would be friends with no one. This, perhaps the correct reading of this statement is really, it's saying for all X, if X is friends with everyone, if for all Y, X is friends with Y, then really they're friends with no one. Then it's not the case that there is a Y such that X is friends with Y. And this is not a contradiction. This actually is equivalent to saying there isn't anyone who is friends with everyone. And on a problem set, I would accept either of these answers, but I do think that really this second translation here is really capturing what this statement is trying to say, even if it, strictly speaking, could be interpreted in this first way. It's really this second one that captures the true intent of this statement. And so I'm just giving this example to illustrate that translation is not a purely mechanical process. This statement has the same form as the previous two. It looks like a statement of the form the F is G, and it could theoretically be read that way, but it really makes more sense, I think, to read it this way. So when you're doing translation, you can notice forms of statements like the F is G and apply those and translate based on that basic form that you recognize. But you also still have to kind of stay alert to what is this sentence really saying. And it may look like other statements that you've seen before, and it may seem like it could be translated exactly like statements that you've seen before, but when you really read it and think about it, it's saying something different. So you kind of just have to stay alert to that as you do translation.